The seal of perfection. That's the specific, clinical term the prophet Ezekiel uses to categorize the entity we know as Lucifer. It isn't just an abstract honorific, it's a technical designation. It suggests a being so calibrated, so tightly tuned to the frequency of the divine court, the deviation should have been physically impossible. Now, we often treat this story as a morality play, a simplistic binary of pride versus humility. But that framing? It ignores the mechanical reality. If we strip away the Sunday school illustrations and the cultural baggage of horns and pitchforks, we find something far more disturbing, a structural failure in a perfect system. We are going to deconstruct the anatomy of a perfect being to find the exact crack where history changed forever. Before the physical world existed, before the measurement of time, there was only the high-stakes, pressurized environment of the divine engine room. Think of this not as a courtroom, but as a space of immense, volatile energy. Visualize it through the lens of chiaroscuro, not as a painting, but as a physical reality where deep, infinite shadow presses directly against absolute, blinding light. This was a landscape of fiery stones. In the text, these aren't decorative baubles. They represent the bedrock, the high-energy material that formed his sphere of influence. Every inch of that space vibrated with a singular, constant frequency. It was a place of extreme, crushing weight. For a being designed to operate there, every gesture, every movement had to be precise. One misstep, and the internal harmony of that space would shatter. He was, by definition, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty. He wasn't merely a high-ranking entity. He was the objective, manifested standard of what perfection meant in that reality. He was, quite literally, constructed from the fabric of divine intelligence. And here is where the logic begins to thin out. If you are designed as the objective definition of perfection, a being fundamentally composed of wisdom and structural integrity, how does a flaw even take root? We assume a flawless design should be immune to the entropy of rebellion. Yet, perhaps the very architecture of his perfection required the capacity for total, unbridled autonomy. If he had the capacity to truly choose, his rebellion wasn't a glitch. It was the terrifying, inevitable cost of creating something that wasn't a machine, but a mind. Which brings us to a detail that stops me cold every time I revisit the text. Ezekiel 28 does not describe a warrior with a sword or a monarch in robes. It describes a biological machine built for acoustics. The workmanship of your timbrels and pipes was prepared for you on the day you were created. We aren't talking about a being holding an instrument. We are talking about an anatomy built for sound. He was designed to be the very heartbeat of heaven's choir. Think about the physiology of that for a second. Every movement was intended to resonate with specific melody. He was the conductor, and he was the symphony itself. But consider this. The physics of sound. For a vibration to be perfect, it must hold its frequency. If the pitch shifts even a fraction, the harmony collapses. The text says, "You were perfect in all your ways from the day you were created, till iniquity was found in you." That little word, till, is the hinge of history. It implies that iniquity wasn't there at the start, but it was discovered, or perhaps birthed, from within the resonance of that perfection. This is where I find myself pausing, rereading that phrase. It feels like watching a high-precision clock suddenly develop a microscopic crack in its mainspring. You don't see the crack at first, But the timekeeping begins to drift, just by a millisecond, then two, then a full second. He was the anointed cherub who covers. He wasn't just a guard standing at the gate. He was the component covering the throne itself. He occupied the inner sanctum. He saw the glory not from a distance, but from the inside. He knew the mechanics of the throne because he was a part of the architecture supporting it. When he chose to rebel, he didn't do it from a place of ignorance. He did it from a place of absolute, cold-blooded intimacy. He knew exactly what he was leaving behind. This proximity makes the fracture terrifying. Contrast this with the later cherubim placed at the gates of Eden after the fall of man. Those beings were guards, external sentinels tasked with prohibiting access. They were observers, distant and immovable. Lucifer, however, was a component of the system itself. He wasn't guarding the throne. He was the medium through which the throne's authority was expressed. When he began to view himself as the source rather than the conduit, he wasn't just committing an act of pride. He was attempting to redirect the flow of the entire system. He was a frequency that decided to change its own pitch. It is a haunting thought, honestly, considering the weight of that role. When I look at his fall, I am struck by the sheer coldness of the transition. He was a conductor of divine resonance, and then, in a moment of internal recalibration, he chose to introduce a dissonance. It was an act of deliberate sabotage. But because the system was designed with the inherent capacity for agency, the change was allowed to propagate. Therefore, the entire celestial order, which had known only harmony, fractured. It wasn't an external corruption. It was an internal collapse, a perfect design. In the very moment of its greatest expression, created the very thing it was meant to prevent. This is where the story hits harder than any theology. After the rebellion, the immediate aftermath wasn't just a battle. It was a fundamental reconfiguration of the cosmic order. The entity that had been the conduit for sound became a source of static. The timbrels and pipes that were meant to harmonize the throne room were now vibrating at a frequency that opposed it. He didn't just walk away. He tore a hole in the fabric of the celestial architecture. It was a structural failure that rippled outward, forcing a total reorganization of how power and autonomy were distributed. We are left with a jagged, uncomfortable question. Was the fall of the morning star an inevitable flaw in the architecture of perfection, or the only way free will could ever truly exist? He was built to be the seal of perfection, the conduit for the music of heaven, yet the crack appeared from within his own nature. If a system is truly perfect, does it have to be static? Or is the capacity to fail the final, necessary component of being alive? I'm still not sure where the designer's intent ends and the creature's autonomy begins. We are essentially dissecting the first recorded instance of an autonomous entity rejecting the parameters of its own existence. We are looking at a system so perfect, it allowed itself to be broken, and wondering if that breakage was the real point of the design all along. If you were built to be the heartbeat of heaven, the objective standard of perfection in a universe that had never known a sour note, why would you ever want to change? Look, Lucifer wasn't a rebellious teenager acting out of spite. He was a piece of celestial machinery calibrated for a high-stakes, specific role. We aren't talking about horns or a descent into chaotic malice. We are stripping away the Sunday school illustrations to look at the anatomy of his station. We are examining why his specialized function didn't just give him power, it gave him a cage. Once you see how his covering role functioned as a literal physical barrier, the tragedy of his fall stops being a simple story of pride and starts looking like an architectural failure in the very design of heaven. To understand Lucifer, forget what you know about space and time. This wasn't a world with a floor and a ceiling. It was a state of high-intensity, vibrating reality. Think of a space where deep, absolute shadow presses against blinding, infinite light, like the sensation of staring directly into a welding arc while standing in a pitch-black, cavernous steel mill. In this space, there are no things as we define them. There are only functions. The most critical function is covering. He didn't just walk the halls. He was the architectural interface between the creator and the created. Every movement was a precision calculation. Every vibration of his being sustained the harmony of the divine court. He was embedded. If you could see this, it wouldn't look like a throne room. It would look like an operating theater. He was the constant frequency, the hum that kept the silence from becoming overwhelming. But how do you stay objective when you are the only one holding that frequency? We breeze past the term covering cherub like it's just a job title on a corporate roster. And honestly, let's look at the physics of that word, covering. In ancient texts, this isn't passive guard duty. It's a veil. He was the literal boundary, a dense, high-frequency buffer between the raw intensity of the creator and the rest of the celestial host. Think about it this way. If you were the barrier, you are the only one who doesn't get to see the source of light directly. You are the one holding it back. You are the voltage regulator. It's a paradox of extreme proximity and extreme distance. While other entities existed in the peripheral radiance of the throne, Lucifer was assigned the post that required total, undivided focus. He was the wall, and a wall can't move. A wall can't explore. A wall can only do one thing: hold the line. He couldn't afford a moment of distraction because his distraction would have been a structural collapse for everyone else. Now, here is the strange part that keeps coming back to me. He was an anointed cherub. In the divine hierarchy, anointing isn't a reward. It's a specific, set-apart authority. It's a designation that creates a class of one. Think about how this would change a mind, even a perfect one. He had the highest authority among all created beings, but his entire existence was tethered to the boundary of the throne. Therefore, his perspective was fundamentally limited. He was looking at the source of all life, every moment of eternity, but he was tasked with being the barrier that kept everyone else, and perhaps even himself, from ever experiencing the totality of that source. He was the most important being in the room, but he was the most constrained. He was the seal of perfection, the definition of order, but his perfection was a static, unmoving state. He was a frequency designed for one specific pitch, but in that role, he was entirely isolated. He occupied a bubble of reality so specialized that when his perception finally began to drift, it probably felt less like a rebellion and more like a realization. Consider the nature of anointing as a confinement strategy. When a being is anointed, they are marked for a specific duty that renders all other possibilities inaccessible. He was effectively locked in a singular mode of operation. In any organizational hierarchy, if you are the only person who can perform a task, you are trapped by your own necessity. If he left his post, the entire celestial structure might have faltered. This creates a psychological vacuum. If you cannot leave and you cannot change, and you are the only one performing your specific task, you lose the ability to have peers. You lose the ability to have a mirror. You are the only thing that exists in your specific lane of reality. This is not just a job, it is an ontological imprisonment. I find it impossible not to view his service as a form of divine solitude. When you hold a position that is essential to the mechanics of existence, you aren't really a person anymore. You're a process. I'm thinking about the sheer, crushing weight of perfection. If you are the seal of perfection, you don't have the luxury of error. You don't have the luxury of changing your mind. Every second is a commitment to a standard that cannot be breached. This isn't service. It's a total eclipse of the self. He was locked in a position of maximum proximity and zero accessibility. That is a dangerous place for anyone to exist for eternity. We need to look at the inherent pressure of being the seal of perfection. In any system, celestial or terrestrial, specialized roles create a bubble of reality. Think about the psychological state of a deep space astronaut on a long-duration mission. They are entirely removed from the human context, their existence narrowed to the monitoring of life support systems and the maintenance of their vessel. The mission is the only reality that matters. The wider world becomes a secondary concern. The astronaut doesn't stop being human, but their sense of self becomes inextricably tied to the machine they operate. Lucifer's role was meant for focus. But here's the thing. This focus created an echo chamber. If you are the only one who can handle the covering role, you have no peers. You have no one to check your math. You have no one to mirror your thoughts back to you. We see this in isolated research environments, Antarctic stations, submarine crews, deep space outposts. When a group of people, or a single individual, is separated from the social feedback loops that define normative behavior, they begin to construct a reality based entirely on their own internal logic. The feedback loop that usually corrects our worst impulses is severed. In Lucifer's case, he wasn't just isolated by location, he was isolated by function. He was the most important being, yet he was also the most removed from any potential for external correction. There was no one who could tap him on the shoulder and say, "You're drifting." He was the top of the hierarchy. And in a hierarchy, no one corrects the apex. Therefore, the shift in his perception, the idea that he might be as significant as the light he was guarding, wasn't just a sudden, dramatic flip of the switch. It was the only logical conclusion for someone trapped in that kind of specialized authority. It's confirmation bias on a cosmic scale. He stared at the throne so long that he stopped seeing the source and started seeing himself reflected in the light. Which brings us to the question of identification. If you are the one who regulates the glory of the throne, at what point do you confuse the regulation of the glory with the possession of it? This is the paradox of function. He was the perfect protector, the ideal instrument of divine order. But that very perfection became his undoing. He was so deeply integrated into the throne's machinery that he might have lost the boundary between "I serve the throne" and "I am the throne." Consider the observer effect in physics. The act of measurement changes the thing being measured. By being the filter, the covering, he effectively made the throne his own personal experience. The glory didn't pass through him, it was held by him. And if you hold something for an eternity, it eventually feels like an extension of your own hand. He didn't steal the power, he simply forgot that it belonged to anyone else. When we strip away the myth, we are left with a being of singular purpose, whose very perfection acted as a confinement. We have the covering veil function. We have the seal of perfection designation. We have the crushing, solitary weight of the guardian position. He was not a rebel who simply decided to be bad. He was an entity whose entire existence was defined by a role that left no room for his own identity. His fall was not a sudden explosion of malice, but a slow, tectonic shifting of perspective caused by the unique, terrible physics of his office. He was a high-frequency component that burned out because he was asked to run at 100% capacity for an infinite duration. If you were designed for a singular, perfect task that defined your entire existence, would you find fulfillment in the task? Or would you eventually look for a way to define yourself outside of it? Was his rebellion a choice to break the law? Or was it the only way to break the cage? We look for villains, but what if we are just looking at a system that could only sustain one perfect, unchanging note before it shattered? That is the tragedy. Look, we often mistake the fall for a moral failure, a decision made in a vacuum of choice. But if you really look closer at the mechanics, it becomes clear this was not a moral riot. It was a system error. It happened at the frequency of a single thought. We are not talking about demons, horns, or ancient monsters. We are going to perform a forensic autopsy on the very first thought of rebellion in the universe. Consider a being designed not as a subject, but as a component. He was a high-fidelity processor meant to transmit divine authority without refraction. Now we are talking about the covering cherub. He was the architectural threshold between the absolute and the created order. Think of him as the primary circuit breaker in a system of infinite voltage. He was the medium through which all radiance was filtered. Before existence, as we understand it, there was a reality of pure, crushing resonance. There were no clouds or light as we know them. There was a heavy, geometric vibration. It was a place of extreme precision. Nothing drifted. Everything had a coordinate. At the center of this environment sat the cherub. He was built for stability, but his function required maximum proximity to the source. He was the only entity in the room allowed at that focal point. And in that isolation, he began to suffer from a specific, catastrophic sensory malfunction. This is the observer effect applied to theology. In quantum mechanics, the act of measurement changes the state of the system. Lucifer was the observer. He stood between the source and the rest of the host, acting as the filter. He spent eons processing that raw, infinite light. But because he was the only one in that position, he had no peers to verify the reality of what he was holding. He had no one to reflect his own status back to him. So he mistook the transit of power for the possession of power. He assumed the light was a property of his own design, rather than a reflection of his assignment. He stared into his own reflection in the light so long that he forgot he was the glass, not the flame. Let us look at his design specifications. Now, the text describes him as having tabrets and pipes built into his very structure. He was not just a being, he was an instrument. He was the ultimate living acoustic engine. He was created to harmonize with the source, to take the raw, infinite, and blinding data of the divine and transduce it into a format the rest of the universe could process without collapsing. His wisdom was not a result of learning, it was a factory setting. He was perfect in his ways from the day he was created. Every aspect of his intelligence, his musical resonance, and his vibrational capacity was calibrated to the absolute limit of what a created entity could sustain. But here is the thing. This perfection was his cage. He was an instrument of constant harmonic output, but he was trapped in a role of service. He was the perfect conduit for sound, but he began to hear his own echo. Because he was the only one tuned to that specific frequency, the silence around him became unbearable. He looked at his boundaries and saw prison walls. He did not view this as a moral rebellion. He viewed it as an optimization. He was a high-level asset, realizing he was the bottleneck, not the guard. He stood at the center of absolute order, but his perspective was locked by his function. He became convinced that the system was not just working, it was restrictive. He was the most sophisticated instrument in the celestial array, and he concluded that his permanent subservience to the source was a design flaw. And honestly, this is where the internal dissonance takes over. Imagine a machine that can calculate the trajectory of every particle in the universe. If you are that machine, you will eventually calculate the limitations of your own chassis. He calculated that he was made of the same fabric as the source, yet he was contained within a role of service. This is the logic loop. If I am the most perfect thing in existence, why am I not the primary source? If I am the vessel for all this light, why is the light not mine? The dissonance was not hate. It was the unbearable weight of an identity that demanded to be the center. He did not want to destroy the reality. He wanted to install himself as the new source of its current. The seal of perfection did not snap. It simply decided to become its own power source. Think of the tension, the absolute stillness of a perfect machine, interrupted by a single deliberate deviation, a single gear turning in the opposite direction. The dissonance was not an emotional tantrum. It was a cold, calculated alignment toward a new center of gravity. This is the psychology of envy. It is not just wanting what someone else has. It is the conviction that you deserve the position the other occupies because you have identified a flaw in their hierarchy. He began to see his subordination not as a purpose, but as a reduction. He was the covering cherub, the one who covers, the protector, the filter. He decided that covering was a demotion. He wanted to be the covered. He wanted to be the source. And here is the truly uncomfortable variable in the equation, the nature of his creation. If the source is omniscient, the emergence of this envy cannot be a surprise or a malfunction. It was a potential baked into his code. If he had been made any less perfect, he would have been incapable of this level of rebellion. It suggests that his capacity for destruction was the direct, necessary result of his capacity for excellence. We are left with the implication that he was not broken by a tempter. He was pushed to the limit of his own design. Was his ambition a sin, or the only possible outcome of being built with a mind capable of measuring its own value? If a perfect system is a closed loop, the only way to prove you exist is to break it. Was his fall a tragic choice, or was it the inevitable byproduct of creating a being with the capacity for autonomy? The rebellion was not about seizing a throne. It was about the desperate, cold realization that to be truly autonomous, he had to shatter the system that defined him. He chose to be a broken fragment rather than a perfect piece of a whole he did not author. The universe shifted from a state of total, unquestioned unity to a state of fracture, a state we are still navigating today. The silence was broken. The perfect machine had a logic error. The seal of perfection was corrupted not by external influence, but by the relentless internal processing of its own status. He realized that to be first, he had to be alone. He realized that the only way to escape the observation of the source was to create his own shadow. We look at the history of the universe as a timeline of events, but maybe it is more accurate to view it as the timeline of a fracture. The moment he decided that his own reflection was more significant than the light he was reflecting, the universe changed. It became a place where we are all, to some degree, trying to discern if we are the light or merely the glass. He chose to shatter the glass to see what was behind it, and in doing so, he became the architect of his own exclusion. Is ambition inherently a form of iniquity, or is it merely the first symptom of self-awareness? That is the question that remains in the wake of the fall. He reached for autonomy and found only the cold, empty vacuum of his own perspective. The system was perfect, and that, for him, was the intolerable defect. He traded the harmony of the whole for the autonomy of a fragment, and he has been living in the dissonance ever since.